Welcome to JK Tells a Story, where real-life dramas unfold. Sit back and enjoy today's tale. Daniel Cross opened his eyes to darkness. Where am I? The steady beeping of medical equipment filled his ears, and thick bandages wrapped his head. It was obviously a hospital, but he couldn't remember why. The last clear memory was stepping off the plane at O'Hare after a week-long tax seminar in Las Vegas. Rebecca had texted that morning about making dinner and being excited to have him home. He'd felt grateful for such a loving, supportive wife. Now, lying in this hospital bed, that memory felt like someone else's life. A nurse entered, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes. When she saw him awake, her face brightened with relief. "Mr. Cross, thank goodness you're awake," she said, checking the monitors. Her name tag read, Linda Parker, RN. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck," Dan croaked. "What happened? How long have I been here?" 15 days unconscious. "Let me page Dr. Bennett." She pressed the call button. "Are you in pain?" "Scale of 1 to 10. About a 7. My head feels like it's exploding." "That's expected with your injuries. I'll get you something for pain." As she prepared to leave, Dan called out, "Nurse Parker, has my wife been here? Rebecca Cross? She must be worried sick." Linda's expression shifted, a shadow crossing her features. "Dr. Bennett will discuss everything with you. Just rest for now." Something in her tone chilled him, but before he could ask more, she slipped out. Dr. Michael Bennett entered within minutes. A distinguished man in his 50s with graying hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mr. Cross, I'm Dr. Bennett, your attending physician. Very good to see you awake. How are you feeling?" "Confused and in pain." "Dr. Bennett, what exactly happened to me? I can't remember anything after getting home." Dr. Bennett consulted his chart before speaking. "You were brought to Northwestern Memorial 15 days ago with severe injuries. You had significant head trauma, multiple contusions, several cracked ribs, and extensive facial injuries that required reconstructive surgery." The words hit Dan like physical blows. "Reconstructive surgery? How bad was it?" "Quite extensive, I'm afraid. Your cheekbone was fractured in 2 places, your nose was broken, and there was considerable soft tissue damage. We did our best to repair everything, but there will be some changes to your appearance." Dan's hand moved instinctively toward his bandaged face. "What kind of changes? Why don't we take a look?" Dr. Bennett said gently. "Are you ready for that?" Dan nodded, though dread filled his stomach. Dr. Bennett began carefully removing the bandages, layer by layer. When most of the gauze was gone, the doctor handed him a small mirror. The reflection that stared back at him was shocking. It was clearly Daniel Cross, but different enough that someone who hadn't seen him in years might not immediately recognize him. His nose was slightly different, his cheekbones more pronounced, and there were still traces of bruising around his eyes. The overall effect made him look harder, more weathered. "The swelling has gone down considerably," Dr. Bennett explained, "and the bruising will continue to fade. But yes, your appearance has changed somewhat. I'm sorry we couldn't prevent that. It's like looking at a stranger," Dan murmured, still staring at the reflection. "I understand this is difficult. We have counselors available to help you process all of this." Dr. Bennett paused. "Mr. Cross, I need to ask you some questions about what you remember. Do you recall how you sustained these injuries?" Dan closed his eyes and tried to concentrate. Fragments of memory flickered like broken film. Walking into his house, voices that shouldn't have been there, someone grabbing him from behind. "There were people in my house," he said slowly. "Multiple people. But I can't remember details. That's not uncommon with head trauma of this severity. Your memories may return gradually, or they may remain fragmented. The important thing is that you're alive and recovering." "Dr. Bennett," Dan said, meeting the physician's eyes, "how did I get here? Who found me?" You were brought in by paramedics after a 911 call. The caller didn't identify themselves, but they gave your address and said there was an injured man who needed immediate medical attention. And my wife, Rebecca, she must have been frantic when I didn't come home. Dr. Bennett's expression became carefully neutral. Mr. Cross, I think you should speak with the police about that. Detective Williams has been waiting to talk with you ever since you were admitted. The police? Why would the police be involved? Because this wasn't an accident, Mr. Cross. Someone did this to you deliberately. Before Dan could respond, there was a knock on the door. 2 police officers entered, a seasoned detective in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and tired eyes. The other was a younger officer with an alert expression and a notepad in his hand. Mr. Cross, I'm Detective Williams with Chicago PD, the older man said, showing his badge. This is Officer Johnson. We've been waiting to speak with you about what happened. Dr. Bennett stood up. I'll leave you gentlemen to talk. Mr. Cross, I'll check on you later this evening. Detective Williams settled into the chair Dr. Bennett had vacated. First, let me say how glad we are that you pulled through. You were in pretty bad shape when you arrived here. Detective, I need to know, where's my wife? Is she okay? Williams and Johnson exchanged glances. Mr. Cross, that's one of the things we need to discuss with you. When did you last speak with your wife? The morning I left Las Vegas. She texted me that she was making dinner and was excited to have me home. And when you arrived home, was she there? Dan tried to remember, but the memories were like trying to grasp water. I think there were people in the house who shouldn't have been there, but I can't remember if Rebecca was one of them. Detective Williams leaned forward. Mr. Cross, your wife wasn't at the house when paramedics arrived. In fact, she hasn't been back to the house at all since you were hospitalized. What do you mean? Where is she? We were hoping you could tell us. She hasn't reported you missing, hasn't visited you here, and her current whereabouts are unknown. Dan felt like the room was spinning. That's impossible. Rebecca loves me. If something happened to me, she'd be here. Officer Johnson spoke up. Sir, when we investigated your home, we found evidence that you'd been restrained and held there for several hours before the attack. This wasn't a random break-in or robbery. Nothing was stolen, and the violence appears to have been very targeted. Restrained? What do you mean? There were zip ties found at the scene, along with a chair that had been moved from your dining room to the living room. There were also, Williams paused, choosing his words carefully, other indications that suggest you were forced to watch something that caused you significant distress before the physical assault began. Suddenly, flashes of memory hit Dan like lightning strikes. Being tied to his dining room chair. Voices demanding something from him. Refusing to cooperate. And then pain. So much pain. But there was something else. Something that made his stomach churn. Rebecca. Rebecca had been there, but not as a victim. I remember now, Dan whispered, his face going pale. She was there. Rebecca was there, but she wasn't tied up. She was with them. Detective Williams nodded grimly. Can you tell us what they wanted from you? They wanted me to do something. Something with numbers, with financial records. They said I had access to information they needed. Dan's head was pounding as more memories surfaced. There was a man in an expensive suit. He kept talking about business arrangements and mutual benefits. When I told them I wouldn't help them, that's when they hurt you, Johnson finished. Yes. And Rebecca. God. Rebecca just stood there and watched. Williams made notes. Mr. Cross, we need to ask about your work. You're an accountant with Brennan Associates, correct? Yes. I handle tax preparation and financial consulting for various businesses. Any of those businesses involve large cash transactions? Restaurants? Construction companies? Import-export operations? Dan thought carefully. Several, actually. I have a number of restaurant clients, And there's a real estate development company that's been a major account for about 2 years. What's the name of the real estate company? Torino Properties. They're one of our biggest clients. Very profitable, always pay their fees in cash. Detective Williams and Officer Johnson looked at each other with obvious recognition. Mr. Cross, Williams said carefully, what can you tell us about your relationship with Vincent Torino? I've never met him personally. All communication goes through an intermediary. But they pay very well for detailed financial reporting and tax preparation services. Have they ever asked you to handle any unusual transactions? Like what? Anything that seemed designed to obscure the source of income or make illegitimate funds appear legitimate? Dan shook his head. No, nothing like that. They're very meticulous about documentation, but I assumed that was just good business practice. He paused. Detective, are you suggesting that Torino Properties is involved in something illegal? Mr. Cross, Vincent Torino is a person of interest in several ongoing investigations related to money laundering and organized crime. If you've been handling his financial affairs, the implication hit Dan like a sledgehammer. You think they were trying to force me to help them launder money? It's a strong possibility. And if your wife was involved in setting you up? Dan closed his eyes, trying to process the betrayal. The woman he'd loved and trusted for 5 years had sold him out to criminals. How long do you think this has been going on? We're not sure yet, but we're investigating your wife's activities over the past year. We do know that she's been employed at a different law firm than the one you mentioned. What do you mean? You said she works for Morrison Legal Services, but according to employment records, she's been working for Whitfield Associates for over a year. Dan felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. She's been lying to me for over a year? It appears so. Marcus Whitfield is Vincent Torino's attorney. The pieces were falling into place, creating a picture so ugly that Dan could barely comprehend it. So she was feeding them information about me, about my clients, about my work methods. That's our working theory. Mr. Cross, I have to ask, do you have any enemies? Anyone who might want to hurt you for personal reasons? I'm an accountant, Dan said weakly. The most controversial thing I do is argue with the IRS about deductions. Detective Williams stood up. Mr. Cross, I need to be very direct with you about something. The people who did this to you are dangerous, and they're still out there. If they think you can identify them or that you might cooperate with law enforcement, you could still be in danger. What are you saying? I'm saying you need to be very careful about where you go and who you trust. We're going to provide you with some protection, but ultimately, your safety may depend on how this investigation unfolds. After the police left, Dan lay in the gathering darkness, trying to process everything he'd learned. His wife had betrayed him to criminals. He'd been unknowingly involved in money laundering operations. Someone had tried to torture him into becoming an active participant in criminal activity, and when he'd refused, they'd nearly killed him. The Daniel Cross who had stepped off that plane from Las Vegas no longer existed. That man had lived in a world where people were trustworthy, where marriage vows meant something, where hard work and integrity were enough to build a good life. That world had been revealed as an illusion, and the man who believed in it was gone. But who would take his place? The next morning brought visitors. James Brennan, his boss, arrived with Sarah Kim and Michael Torres. Dan, look at you, James said, shocked. We've all been worried sick. Thanks for coming, Dan managed. How's the office handling things? We're covering your clients, but everyone wants to know when you're coming back. I'm not sure I am. The police think this attack was related to one of our clients. Which client? James frowned. Torino Properties. James went pale. Oh God. Dan, I'm sorry. Why? What do you know? 6 months ago, a man came asking specific questions about you. Client list, expertise, schedule. Said he represented a potential new client. Who was it? Marcus Whitfield, representing Torino Properties. We gave him your contact info, but you never mentioned hearing from him. Dan felt a chill. I never got any call. That's what was strange, Sarah added. When we asked weeks later, you said you'd never heard of him. Because I hadn't. They were gathering intelligence without my knowledge. Michael shook his head. Using our office to scout you. That's sick. Dan told them about Rebecca's deception and the money laundering operation. Rebecca was involved. Sarah gasped. She seemed so devoted to the money they were paying her. What will you do now? Michael asked. Detective Williams says building a case could take years. Meanwhile, I'm supposed to hope they don't finish what they started. You could relocate, James suggested. Change your name, start over somewhere else. Run away, you mean? There's no shame in protecting yourself. Dan looked out the window at the Chicago skyline. Maybe, but first I want to know exactly what I'm running from. After his colleagues left, Dan spent the afternoon thinking. The police investigation would follow official channels, which meant it would be thorough but slow. Torino and his associates would have time to cover their tracks, destroy evidence, maybe even eliminate witnesses. By the time the authorities were ready to make arrests, there might not be enough evidence left to convict anyone. He needed faster answers and more detailed information than the police could provide. He needed someone who could operate outside the constraints of official procedure. That evening, he called information and asked for the number of a private investigation firm. The operator connected him to Rivera Investigations. Rivera Investigations, this is Tony, a gravelly voice answered. Mr. Rivera, my name is Daniel Cross. I need to hire a private investigator for a very serious matter. What kind of matter, Mr. Cross? Someone tried to kill me, my wife was involved, and I think it's connected to organized crime. I need to know who I'm dealing with and how deep this goes. There was a pause. Mr. Cross, that sounds like something the police should be handling. The police are investigating, but they work within certain limitations. I need someone who can be more flexible in their methods. Another pause. Where are you located? Northwestern Memorial Hospital, room 314. I was discharged today, but I'm staying here for one more night for observation. I can be there in an hour. But Mr. Cross, I want to be clear about something up front. I operate within the law. I don't break into places. I don't threaten people. And I don't plant evidence. I understand. I just need information. All right. I'll see you at 7 o'clock. Tony Rivera arrived precisely on time. He was a man in his 50s with weathered features, intelligent gray eyes, and the bearing of someone who had seen enough of the world's ugliness to not be surprised by any new variety of it. He wore a rumpled brown suit and carried a worn leather briefcase. Mr. Cross, he said, extending a firm handshake. Tony Rivera, you look like you've been through hell. That's an accurate assessment. Rivera pulled up a chair and opened his briefcase, revealing a notepad, several pens, and what appeared to be a small recording device. Do you mind if I record this? It helps me keep my facts straight. Go ahead. Tell me everything. Starting from the beginning. Dan recounted the entire story, the business trip, coming home to find intruders, the attack, waking up in the hospital, discovering Rebecca's betrayal, and learning about his connection to Torino Properties. Rivera took detailed notes and asked probing questions. This Marcus Whitfield, what can you tell me about him? Just what the police told me. He's Torino's attorney, and apparently, he's been employing my wife for over a year. Marcus Whitfield, Rivera mused. I know that name. High-end criminal defense attorney. Takes on clients with more money than morals. If your wife is working for him, she's moved up in the world. What do you mean? Whitfield Associates doesn't hire people off the street. They're very selective about their staff because they handle extremely sensitive information. Your wife must have some special qualifications, like being married to an accountant who handles Torino's books. Exactly. Which suggests this whole thing was planned well in advance. Dan felt sick. How long do you think they've been targeting me? Hard to say without more information, but based on what you've told me, I'd guess at least a year. Maybe longer. And I never suspected a thing. Don't beat yourself up about that. These people are professionals at deception. It's what they do for a living. Rivera closed his notepad. Mr. Cross, what's your goal here? Do you want justice through the courts? Or are you looking for something else? What do you mean, something else? I mean, are you content to let the system handle this, knowing that it might take years and might not result in convictions? Or do you want to take a more active role in ensuring that these people face consequences for what they did to you? Dan considered the question carefully. The legal system had rules, procedures, constitutional protections for the accused, all of which meant that guilty people sometimes went free on technicalities. Vincent Torino had money, power, and connections. Even if the police built a solid case against him, his lawyers might find ways to delay trials, suppress evidence, or create reasonable doubt. I want the truth first, Dan said finally. All of it. Then I'll decide what to do with it. Rivera nodded approvingly. Smart answer. The truth is usually the best place to start. How long will it take you to get answers? Give me 72 hours for preliminary findings. But Mr. Cross, I have to warn you about something. Once you start down this path, things tend to escalate. The more you dig into these people's business, the more dangerous they become. They already tried to kill me once. Yes, but that was when they thought you might be useful to them. If they decide you're a threat instead of an asset, they won't bother with torture next time. Dan met Rivera's eyes. Are you trying to talk me out of this? I'm trying to make sure you understand what you're getting into. These aren't ordinary criminals. Vincent Torino has been running his operation for over 20 years without a single conviction. He's smart, ruthless, and well-connected. Then why haven't the police been able to touch him? Because he's very careful about insulating himself from direct involvement in criminal activities. He uses intermediaries, shell companies, legitimate businesses as fronts. By the time you can trace anything back to him personally, the trail has gone cold. But you think you can get closer to him than the police can? I think I can operate in ways that the police can't. I have contacts in places where cops aren't welcome, and I can ask questions that might not be considered admissible in court. Dan was quiet for several minutes, weighing his options. He could try to rebuild his life somewhere else, change his name, start over. But Vincent Torino would still be out there, free to destroy other people's lives. Rebecca would be free to enjoy the money she'd earned by betraying her husband. Marcus Whitfield would continue using his law practice to facilitate criminal activities. The old Daniel Cross might have been content to let the system handle it. But that man was gone, and in his place was someone who understood that sometimes justice required more than faith in legal procedures. Mr. Rivera, I want to hire you, Dan said. But I want more than just information gathering. What do you have in mind? I want to be involved. I want to help with the investigation. And when we find out everything these people have done, I want to help decide how they pay for it. Rivera studied him for a long moment. Mr. Cross, what you're talking about puts us in legally gray territory. I understand that. And it's dangerous. Very dangerous. I understand that too. Are you sure you're ready for what this might involve? Dan thought about Rebecca's betrayal, about being tied to a chair and tortured, about the possibility that Torino might try to kill him again. The old Daniel Cross had been a victim, but this new version of himself didn't have to be. Yes, he said quietly. I'm ready. Rivera was silent for several seconds, then nodded. All right, but if we're going to do this, we're going to need help. This isn't a two-man operation. What kind of help? The kind that knows how to handle dangerous people. I might know someone, but let me make some calls first. How soon can we start? I'll start making inquiries tonight. But Mr. Cross, once we begin this, there's no going back to your old life. You need to understand that. My old life is already gone, Dan said. They made sure of that. Rivera packed up his briefcase and stood to leave. I'll be in touch within 24 hours. In the meantime, be very careful. Don't go back to your house. Don't follow any predictable routines, and don't trust anyone you haven't known for years. What about the hospital? Am I safe here? Probably, but I wouldn't stay any longer than necessary. Do you have somewhere else you can go? I can get a hotel room. Pay cash, use a false name. I'll provide you with some identification that will pass casual inspection. After Rivera left, Dan lay in the hospital bed thinking about what he was committing himself to. He was essentially declaring war on organized crime, with only a private investigator and some unknown allies to help him. The next morning, Dr. Coleman arrived for their first counseling session. She was a woman in her early 40s with auburn hair and compassionate green eyes. Her manner was professional but warm, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had helped many trauma survivors rebuild their lives. Mr. Cross, I'm Dr. Sarah Coleman, she said, settling into the visitor's chair. Dr. Bennett asked me to speak with you about what you've been through. I'm not sure talking is going to help much, Dan replied. You might be surprised. Trauma affects people in ways they don't always recognize immediately. The psychological wounds can be just as debilitating as the physical ones. Dr. Coleman, what would you say if I told you I was considering taking matters into my own hands? She studied his face carefully. I'd say that's a very normal reaction to what you've experienced. The desire for control, for justice, for some way to make sense of senseless violence. Those are all part of the healing process. But acting on those impulses without careful consideration can lead to more trauma, not less. What specifically are you thinking about doing? Dan chose his words carefully. I'm thinking about not waiting for the system to work. These people destroyed my life, and they're going to get away with it unless someone stops them. And you think that someone should be you. Who else? The police say it could take years to build a case. Meanwhile, Torino and his people are free to hurt other families the way they hurt mine. Dr. Coleman nodded thoughtfully. Daniel, can I ask you something? Before this happened, what kind of man did you consider yourself to be? I don't understand. Were you someone who solved problems with violence? Someone who believed in taking the law into your own hands? No, of course not. I was just a regular guy, an accountant. I believed in working hard, following the rules, trusting the system. And how did that work out for you? The question hit him harder than he'd expected. Not very well, obviously. So now you're thinking about becoming a different kind of man. Someone who doesn't follow the rules, who doesn't trust the system. Is that accurate? Maybe. Daniel, I want you to think very carefully about something. The men who did this to you, what kind of people are they? Criminals? Animals? More specifically, they're people who believe that violence is an acceptable way to solve problems. People who think the rules don't apply to them. People who justify their actions by telling themselves that their goals are more important than other people's rights. Dan saw where she was going. You're saying that if I go after them, I become like them. I'm saying that you need to be very careful about what you're willing to sacrifice in the name of justice. Because once you cross certain lines, it becomes easier to cross them again. So what's the alternative? Just accept that they win. The alternative is to find a way to stop them without losing yourself in the process. After Dr. Coleman left, Dan had more visitors. Detective Williams returned with Officer Johnson and Detective Thompson, a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s. Mr. Cross, this is Detective Thompson, Williams said. She specializes in financial crimes, and she's been looking into the Torino organization. Detective Thompson pulled out a thick file. Mr. Cross, we've been investigating Vincent Torino for 3 years. What happened to you might be the break we've been looking for. How so? Because you're the first person we've found who can provide direct testimony about being coerced into participating in money laundering activities. Most of Torino's victims either cooperate willingly or end up dead. Lucky me. In a way, yes. Your survival and your willingness to talk could be the key to bringing down his entire operation. Thompson opened her file and spread several photographs on the bedside table. Do you recognize any of these men? Dan studied the photos. One showed a well-dressed man in his 50s with cold eyes and an expensive suit. I think I recognize him. He might have been one of the men in my house. That's Marcus Whitfield, Torino's attorney. What about this one? The second photo showed a younger man with thick dark hair and a scar along his left jaw. Yes, definitely. He was there. He's the one who hurt me. His name is Frank Castellano. He's Torino's enforcer. And this one. The third photo made Dan's blood run cold. It showed Vincent Torino himself, a man in his early 60s with silver hair, penetrating dark eyes, and the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. I'm not sure, Dan said slowly. There was someone else there, someone the others deferred to, but I was pretty badly beaten by that point. My memory of the end is fuzzy. That's understandable, Thompson said. Mr. Cross, I want to be completely honest with you about what we're dealing with. Vincent Torino has been running criminal enterprises in Chicago for over 20 years. He's connected to 3 known murders, countless assaults, and millions of dollars in money laundering operations. And he's never been convicted of anything? He's very good at insulating himself from direct involvement in criminal activities. He uses legitimate businesses as fronts, employs people like Marcus Whitfield to handle legal issues, and relies on enforcers like Castellano to handle problems. Detective Williams leaned forward. But Mr. Cross, your case could be different. You're a respected professional with no criminal background. No reason to lie. Your testimony about what they tried to force you to do, combined with the physical evidence from your attack, could finally give us enough to bring charges. What about Rebecca? My wife. Detective Thompson consulted her notes. We've been investigating her activities as well. Over the past year, she's received over $300,000 in payments from various shell companies connected to Torino's operation. The number hit Dan like a physical blow. $300,000? She's been providing them with detailed information about your work, your clients, your personal schedule. Essentially everything they needed to know to target you effectively. And she was living a double life the entire time. More than that, Thompson continued, we've discovered that she's been romantically involved with Marcus Whitfield for approximately 10 months. They've been seen together at expensive restaurants, staying at luxury hotels, traveling to Las Vegas and Miami. Dan felt sick. Not only had Rebecca betrayed him for money, she'd been having an affair while she was doing it. There's something else, Williams added gently. We found evidence that she was involved in recruiting other potential victims. She apparently used her position as Whitfield's employee to identify other accountants and financial professionals who might be useful to Torino's organization. She's been doing this to other people? At least 2 other cases that we know of. Both men are currently cooperating with Torino's operation. The implications were staggering. Rebecca hadn't just betrayed Dan. She'd made a career out of betraying people. She was actively involved in an ongoing criminal conspiracy that was destroying lives and families. Detective Thompson, Dan said quietly, what happens if I testify against these people? Honestly, it will be dangerous. Torino doesn't hesitate to eliminate witnesses, and he has the resources to reach people even when they're in protective custody. So my choices are to live in fear for the rest of my life or to hide and let them continue hurting other people? There might be other options, Williams said. We're exploring the possibility of a federal investigation. If we can get the FBI involved, we'd have more resources to protect you and to build a comprehensive case against the entire organization. How long would that take? Thompson and Williams exchanged glances. Realistically, 18 months to 2 years before we could bring it to trial. And in the meantime, Torino continues operating. We do everything we could to disrupt his activities. But yes, he'd probably remain free during the investigation. After the detectives left, Dan sat alone with his thoughts. The legal system could eventually bring justice, but it would be slow, uncertain, and dangerous for him. Meanwhile, Torino would have nearly 2 years to eliminate witnesses, destroy evidence, and possibly escape justice entirely. There had to be another way. That evening, Tony Rivera returned with news. "I've spent the day making inquiries," he said, settling into his usual chair. "I've learned some interesting things about your situation, such as the fact that you're not Vincent Torino's only problem right now. There's another federal investigation closing in on him from a different angle." "What kind of investigation?" "The FBI has been tracking money flowing from Torino's operation to various offshore accounts. They think he's been laundering money for drug cartels, not just local criminals." "That sounds like good news." "It is and it isn't. The good news is that federal investigators have more resources than local police. The bad news is that if Torino thinks he's about to be arrested on federal charges, he might decide to eliminate all potential witnesses before that happens. Including me. Especially you. You're the one person who can provide direct testimony about being coerced into money laundering activities." Rivera pulled out a small notebook. "I've also learned some things about your wife's current situation, such as she's not just working as a legal secretary anymore. Whitfield has been using her as what they call a honey trap, using her looks and charm to get close to potential targets and gather information about them." "You mean she's become a prostitute?" "More like a high-end intelligence gatherer who uses sex as a tool. But yes, essentially, she's been sleeping with other men as part of her job." Dan closed his eyes. Even after everything he'd learned, this news still hurt. "There's something else," Rivera continued. "I've identified the man I mentioned who might be able to help us." "What kind of help?" "His name is Sam Hayes. Former Marine, did 3 tours in Afghanistan before getting out 2 years ago. He's been working private security since then, but he's looking for something more meaningful." "Why would he want to get involved in this?" "Because his younger brother got mixed up with loan sharks connected to Torino's operation 6 months ago. Kid ended up beaten to death when he couldn't pay what he owed." Dan felt a chill of recognition. "So he has personal reasons for wanting to take down Torino." "Exactly. And he has skills that neither of us possess. Combat training, weapons expertise, surveillance techniques. The kind of things that might be useful if this situation escalates." "You think it will escalate?" "Mr. Cross, you're talking about going up against a man who has killed people for far less than what you're planning. Of course it's going to escalate." Rivera closed his notebook. "I can arrange for you to meet Hayes tomorrow night, if you're interested. But I want you to think very carefully about what you're committing to. Once you bring someone like Hayes into this, you're essentially assembling a team for warfare, not investigation." "And you think that's what this is? Warfare?" "I think that's what it's going to become, whether you want it to or not. The question is whether you want to be prepared for it or whether you want to remain a victim." Dan thought about Rebecca's betrayal, about being tortured in his own home, about the possibility that other families were going through the same thing right now. The legal system might eventually bring justice, but how many more people would suffer while he waited for the wheels of justice to turn? "Set up the meeting," he said quietly. "Mr. Cross, are you absolutely certain about this? Because once we take this step, there's no going back." "I'm certain." "All right. Tomorrow night, 8 o'clock, Millennium Park near Cloud Gate. Come alone, and make sure you're not followed." "How will I recognize him?" "He'll be wearing a Cubs baseball cap and reading a newspaper. Approach him and ask if he knows what time the last train to O'Hare runs. And then you'll be committed to a path that might end with all of us dead or in prison." Rivera stood to leave, then paused at the door. Mr. Cross, can I ask you something? Sure. Are you doing this for justice? Or are you doing this for revenge? Dan considered the question carefully. What's the difference? Justice is about making sure bad people face consequences for their actions. Revenge is about making them suffer the way they made you suffer. And which one do you think I should choose? I think you should be honest with yourself about which one you're actually choosing. Because if this is about revenge, it's going to take you to some very dark places. After Rivera left, Dan walked to the window and looked out at the Chicago skyline. Somewhere out there, Vincent Torino was living in luxury while planning his next crime. Rebecca was enjoying the money she'd earned by destroying her marriage. Marcus Whitfield was using his law practice to facilitate criminal activities. The old Daniel Cross would have trusted the system to handle it. But that man was gone, and in his place was someone who understood that sometimes the system wasn't enough. Tomorrow night, he would take the next step toward becoming that someone. But he tried being a victim, and it hadn't worked out well for him. It was time to try being something else. The next evening, Daniel Cross walked through Millennium Park as the sun set behind the Chicago skyline. He'd been discharged that morning and settled into a small hotel using false identification Tony Rivera had provided. David Carter. He'd also bought new clothes. Dark jeans, leather jacket, work boots. Combined with his changed appearance from facial reconstruction, he barely recognized himself. Near Cloud Gate, he spotted a man matching Rivera's description, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a Cubs cap and reading the Tribune. "Excuse me, do you know what time the last train to O'Hare runs?" The man looked up with intense blue eyes and a weathered face. "Depends on which line you're taking. But if you're asking the right question, there's always another way to get where you need to go." Dan recognized the coded response. "Sam Hayes." "That's right. And you're Daniel Cross." Hayes stood, extending his hand. "Tony told me about your situation. I'm sorry for what happened. Rivera said you might help with my problem. Let's walk." Hayes gestured toward a quieter area. "Your wife was involved in setting you up for Vincent Torino. She'd been feeding them information for over a year. And Torino's people tortured you when you wouldn't cooperate with their money laundering operation." "Yes." Hayes was quiet as they walked. Finally, "My younger brother Tommy was a good kid, smart. Went to college on scholarship to study engineering." Rivera mentioned loan sharks. "Tommy got in over his head with gambling debts senior year. Started borrowing from the wrong people. Before he knew it, he owed $50,000 to an outfit connected to Torino's organization. What happened? They gave him 2 weeks. When he couldn't pay, they beat him to death in an alley behind his apartment. Made it look like a random mugging. I'm sorry. The police investigated but couldn't prove the connection. Case went cold. Tommy's killers are still out there. So you want revenge too? I want justice. There's a difference, though the methods sometimes overlap." Dan studied Hayes's face. "What kind of methods are you talking about?" "The kind that ensure bad people face consequences for their actions, regardless of whether the legal system can touch them." "And you have the skills to make that happen?" Hayes nodded. 3 tours in Afghanistan, specialized training in urban warfare, surveillance, and tactical operations. Since getting out, I've been working private security for corporate executives. But that's just paying the bills. This would be more meaningful. It would also be more dangerous. I've been in danger before. The question is whether you're ready for what this might involve. Dan thought about Rebecca's betrayal, about being tortured in his own home, about the families that Torino was destroying while the legal system moved at a glacial pace. "I'm ready." Hayes studied him for a moment. "Tony says you're an accountant. No military training, no experience with violence beyond what was done to you. Are you sure you can handle this?" "I'm sure I can't handle sitting around waiting to be a victim again." "Fair enough. But if we're going to do this, we need to do it right. That means planning, preparation, and discipline. No cowboy bullshit, no acting on emotion. Everything calculated and controlled. I understand. Do you? Because once we start, Torino's people will figure out what we're doing. They'll come after all of us, not just you. Are you prepared to have their blood on your hands if this goes bad? The question hung in the air between them. Dan realized that Hayes was asking him to acknowledge that this wasn't just about his own revenge anymore. Other people would be at risk because of his choices. Yes, Dan said quietly. I'm prepared for that. Hayes nodded. All right then, let's go meet with Tony and start planning. They walked to Rivera's office, a small space above a pizza restaurant in Wicker Park. The walls were covered with maps of Chicago, photographs of various suspects, and whiteboards covered with notes and timelines. It looked exactly like what Dan had expected a private investigator's office to look like. Rivera was waiting for them with coffee and a spread of documents across his desk. Gentlemen, welcome to the war room. Hayes examined the photographs on the wall. These are all Torino's people? The ones we know about, Rivera replied. Vincent Torino himself, Marcus Whitfield, Frank Castellano, and about a dozen lower-level associates. Dan picked up a photograph of Rebecca. It had been taken recently, showing her leaving an expensive restaurant with Marcus Whitfield. She looked happy, laughing at something he'd said. The sight made Dan's stomach churn. Your wife's been living well, Hayes observed, looking over Dan's shoulder. Apparently so. Rivera spread out a map of Chicago with various locations marked in red. These are Torino's known business interests. Restaurants, construction companies, real estate developments, import businesses. All potential fronts for money laundering. What's our objective? Hayes asked. Are we trying to gather evidence for the police? Or are we planning something more direct? That depends on what we find, Dan said. If we can get enough evidence to guarantee convictions, maybe we work with law enforcement. But if the legal system can't touch them, then we become the consequences they're trying to avoid, Hayes finished. Rivera looked uncomfortable. Gentlemen, I want to be clear about something. I'm a licensed private investigator. I can't be involved in anything that crosses certain legal lines. Understood, Hayes said. You gather information, we decide what to do with it. And if what you decide involves breaking laws, then you'll have plausible deniability. Rivera was quiet for several minutes. Finally, he said, I've been investigating criminals for 15 years. I've seen too many of them walk free on technicalities while their victims suffer. If you two can accomplish what the system can't, I'm not going to stand in your way. Good, Dan said. So what's our first step? Rivera pulled out a thick file. I've been digging deeper into your wife's activities. She's not just providing information to Whitfield anymore. She's actively recruiting new targets. What do you mean? She's been attending social events, charity functions, professional conferences, anywhere she might encounter accountants, lawyers, or financial professionals who could be useful to Torino's operation. Hayes studied the surveillance photos Rivera had taken. She's working as a talent scout. Exactly. And according to my sources, she's identified at least 3 new potential targets in the past month. Dan felt sick. She's going to do to other people what she did to me. Unless we stop her, Rivera said. Which brings me to our first opportunity. He spread out an invitation on the desk. Tomorrow night, there's a fundraiser for the Chicago Children's Hospital at the Palmer House. Your wife will be there, along with Marcus Whitfield and several potential targets. How do you know this? Because I've been monitoring her communications. She's been coordinating with Whitfield about which guests to approach. Hayes picked up the invitation. What kind of security will they have? Standard hotel security, nothing military grade. But Whitfield usually travels with at least 1 bodyguard. Frank Castellano. Probably. He's Torino's primary enforcer. Dan studied the invitation. What are you suggesting we do? Reconnaissance, Hayes said. We observe their operations, identify their methods, maybe get close enough to record some conversations. And then we start disrupting their business. Rivera pulled out another set of documents. I've also identified where your wife is living. Whitfield pays for a condo in River North, but she's rarely there overnight. Where does she stay? Various hotels around the city, usually with different men. She's expanded her services beyond just intelligence gathering. The implications were clear, and Dan felt a mixture of disgust and pity. She's become an escort. High-end, exclusive clientele only. But yes, she's using sex to gather information and influence potential targets. Hayes was studying a building layout. This condo, what kind of security does it have? Standard apartment building security. Doorman during the day, electronic locks, security cameras in the lobby. Easily bypassed. For someone with your skills, probably. Dan looked between Rivera and Hayes. Are you suggesting we break into her apartment? I'm suggesting we gather intelligence about the enemy's operations, Hayes replied. If that intelligence happens to be located in her apartment, then yes. What would we be looking for? Rivera consulted his notes. Communications with Whitfield, lists of potential targets, financial records showing her payments, maybe evidence of other criminal activities. And if we find evidence of crimes, then we have leverage, Hayes said. The question is whether we use that leverage to help the police build a case, or whether we use it for more direct purposes. Dan thought about the 3 new potential targets Rebecca had identified. Right now, they were probably living normal lives, trusting their spouses, believing in the system. In a few weeks or months, they might find themselves tied to chairs in their own homes, being tortured by Frank Castellano. When do we start? Hayes smiled grimly. Tomorrow morning. But first, we need to get you ready. Ready for what? Ready to operate in a world where the rules are different. Physical conditioning, basic self-defense, situational awareness. If you're going to survive what's coming, you need to be more than an accountant with a grudge. Rivera stood up. I'll continue working on intelligence gathering. Financial records, surveillance, communications monitoring. By the time you two are ready to move, I'll have everything you need to know about Torino's operation. How long do you think we have before they figure out what we're doing? Dan asked. Hayes considered the question. If we're careful, maybe a few weeks. But once we start hitting their operations, they'll know someone's targeting them specifically. And then it becomes a war. As they prepared to leave Rivera's office, Dan realized that he was committing to something far more dangerous than he'd initially imagined. But he thought about Tommy Hayes, beaten to death for owing money to the wrong people. He thought about the 3 families that Rebecca was currently targeting. He thought about all the future victims who would suffer if Vincent Torino remained free to operate. The Daniel Cross who had lived a comfortable, trusting life was truly gone. The man who would take his place might end up dead or in prison, but at least he wouldn't be a victim. All right, Dan said quietly. Let's go to war. The next morning, Sam Hayes picked up Dan from his hotel at 6 a.m. sharp. Hayes drove a nondescript gray sedan that looked ordinary but, Dan soon discovered, had been modified with bulletproof glass and reinforced body panels. First rule of this business, Hayes explained as they drove through early morning Chicago traffic. Never use your own vehicle for operational activities. This car belongs to a shell company that can't be traced back to any of us. Where are we going? To a gym where we can work on your conditioning without attracting attention. If you're going to survive what's coming, you need to be in much better physical shape. The gym turned out to be a converted warehouse in an industrial area south of downtown. It was filled with military-style obstacle courses, heavy bags, and combat training equipment. Several other men were working out, all of whom looked like they had military or law enforcement backgrounds. Friends of yours? Dan asked. Former Marines who've stayed in touch. They won't ask questions about what we're doing, but they'll help with training if needed. For the next 3 hours, Hayes put Dan through a grueling workout that included basic self-defense techniques, situational awareness drills, and physical conditioning exercises. By the end, Dan was exhausted but felt more alert and confident than he had in weeks. "You're in better shape than I expected," Hayes said as they cooled down. "The hospital stay didn't do as much damage as it could have. I used to run marathons before Rebecca convinced me to focus more on work and less on hobbies. Well, we're going to get you back in running shape, plus add some skills your marathon training didn't include." They drove to a gun range next, where Hayes introduced Dan to basic firearms training. "I don't want to carry a gun," Dan said as Hayes showed him how to properly hold a pistol. "That's your choice, but you need to know how they work and how to defend against them. Torino's people won't hesitate to use lethal force if they feel threatened." "Have you killed people before?" Hayes was quiet for a moment. "In Afghanistan, yes. It was war and it was necessary. I won't lie to you and say it doesn't change you. Are you prepared to kill again? If it's necessary to protect innocent people or to stop criminals who can't be stopped any other way, yes." "And you think it might be necessary with Torino?" "I think Vincent Torino is responsible for multiple murders, and he won't hesitate to kill us if he gets the chance. So yes, I think it might be necessary." After the gun range, they met Rivera for lunch at a small restaurant in Little Italy. Rivera had spent the morning gathering more intelligence about the evening's fundraiser. "Your wife will definitely be there," he reported, "along with Whitfield, probably Castellano, and at least 3 men she's been targeting." "Who are the targets?" Rivera consulted his notes. "Dr. Richard Hoffman, a cardiologist who handles investments for several medical practices. James Mitchell, a tax attorney who specializes in international business. And Robert Chun, an accountant who works for several import-export companies. All perfect for money laundering operations," Hayes observed. "Exactly. The plan appears to be for your wife to make social contact with them tonight, then follow up over the next few weeks to develop relationships." Dan felt anger building. "We have to warn them." "Warn them about what?" Rivera asked. "That a beautiful woman might try to seduce them? Most men wouldn't see that as a threat. But we could tell them about Torino's operation." Hayes shook his head. "Without proof, we'd just sound like conspiracy theorists. And if word got back to Torino that someone was warning his targets, he'd know someone was actively working against him. So we just let her recruit them." "We gather evidence first," Rivera said. "Tonight's event is an opportunity to observe their methods. Maybe record some conversations. Identify key players in the organization. How do we get into the fundraiser?" Rivera smiled and pulled out an invitation. "I've arranged for you to attend as my guest. You'll be David Carter, a successful businessman considering a large donation to the hospital." "What about you?" Dan asked Hayes. "I'll be providing security from outside the building, making sure no one follows you, watching for threats, ready to provide backup if needed." "You think something could go wrong?" "Something always goes wrong," Hayes said matter-of-factly. "The key is being prepared for it." That evening, Dan found himself standing in the elegant ballroom of the Palmer House, wearing an expensive suit Rivera had helped him select. The transformation was remarkable. He looked like a successful businessman who belonged at such an exclusive event. The ballroom was filled with Chicago's elite. Doctors, lawyers, business executives, politicians. Waitstaff circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres while a string quartet provided background music. It was exactly the kind of event where wealthy professionals would feel comfortable discussing their business affairs. Dan spotted Rebecca almost immediately. She was wearing a stunning red evening gown that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her hair was styled differently than he remembered, and she moved through the crowd with a confidence that seemed new. The woman he'd been married to for 5 years had been replaced by someone who looked like a high-end call girl. Marcus Whitfield was nearby, dressed in a perfectly tailored tuxedo and working the crowd like a politician. He was handsome in an expensive way, with silver hair and the kind of charm that came naturally to successful predators. Dan also spotted Frank Castellano, though he was trying to blend into the background. The enforcer was dressed in a suit but looked uncomfortable in formal wear. His eyes constantly scanned the crowd, and Dan noticed a slight bulge under his left arm that suggested a concealed weapon. "Mr. Carter?" A voice behind him made Dan turn. It was one of the hospital administrators, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair. "I'm Susan Walsh, Director of Development. Mr. Rivera mentioned that you might be interested in supporting our children's cardiac unit." "That's right," Dan replied, falling into the role Rivera had prepared him for. "I've been looking for meaningful ways to give back to the community." As they talked, Dan kept one eye on Rebecca's activities. She was currently engaged in conversation with Dr. Hoffman, laughing at something he'd said and touching his arm in a way that seemed casual but was clearly calculated. "The cardiac unit has saved so many young lives," Ms. Walsh was saying. "Just last month, we performed a surgery on a 3-year-old that wouldn't have been possible without our advanced equipment." "That's wonderful," Dan replied, genuinely moved despite his distraction. What kind of donation would make a significant impact? As Ms. Walsh explained various giving levels, Dan noticed that Rebecca had smoothly transitioned from Dr. Hoffman to James Mitchell, the tax attorney. Her technique was impressive in its subtlety. She appeared to be simply a charming woman making polite conversation, but Dan could see how she was steering the discussions toward professional topics. "Excuse me for a moment," Dan said to Ms. Walsh. "I see someone I should say hello to." He moved closer to where Rebecca was talking with Mitchell, positioning himself behind a pillar where he could overhear their conversation while remaining out of sight. "International tax law must be fascinating," Rebecca was saying. "I imagine you work with clients all over the world." "Quite a few, yes," Mitchell replied. "Though I have to be careful about confidentiality, of course." "Of course. I work in legal services myself, so I understand professional discretion. Though I'm sure you see some interesting business structures in your work." Dan pulled out his phone and activated the recording app Rivera had installed. It would be difficult to get clear audio from this distance, but it might pick up enough to be useful. "Oh, you have no idea," Mitchell said, clearly pleased to have an attractive woman showing interest in his work. "Some of these international corporations have structures so complex that it takes me weeks just to understand how the money flows between subsidiaries." "That sounds like it requires very specialized expertise." "It does. In fact, I'm working on a case right now involving a real estate development company with holdings in 3 different countries. The ownership structure is so convoluted that I'm not sure the client themselves understand how it all works." Dan's pulse quickened. Mitchell might be unknowingly describing exactly the kind of operation Torino would use for money laundering. "How interesting," Rebecca purred. "I imagine that kind of complexity makes it difficult for regulatory agencies to track financial transactions." "Well, that's not really the goal," Mitchell said, though he seemed pleased by the implication. "But yes, complex international structures do tend to provide a certain level of privacy. Privacy is so important in business." "Indeed it is." Dan noticed Marcus Whitfield approaching their conversation. "Time to move." He circulated through the crowd, eventually positioning himself near where Dr. Hoffman was now talking with a group of other physicians. "The investment opportunities in medical real estate are extraordinary right now," Hoffman was saying. "I've been working with a consultant who's helped several doctors in our practice diversify their portfolios." "What kind of consultant?" one of the other doctors asked. "A very sharp attorney who specializes in investment structures for high-net-worth individuals. He's helped us establish some very profitable arrangements." Dan's blood ran cold. Hoffman was already being drawn into Torino's web. "Marcus Whitfield," Hoffman continued. "Brilliant man, very connected. He's arranged several deals that have generated remarkable returns." What kind of deals? Real estate primarily, but also some import-export ventures. The beauty of his approach is that everything is structured to minimize tax liability while maximizing privacy. The other doctors seemed very interested. Dan realized that Hoffman wasn't just being recruited as a potential victim. He was being used to recruit others. As the evening progressed, Dan observed similar conversations throughout the ballroom. Rebecca and Whitfield were working systematically through the crowd, identifying potential targets and beginning the process of drawing them into criminal activities they wouldn't recognize until it was too late. Around 10 o'clock, Dan noticed Frank Castellano speaking quietly into a cell phone near the ballroom's exit. Something in the enforcer's posture suggested urgency. Dan moved closer, hoping to overhear the conversation. "Understand, but the boss wants to move quickly on this one," Castellano was saying. "Yeah, I know it's risky, but he's concerned about the federal investigation." "Federal investigation?" Dan's pulse quickened. "Needs to be dealt with before he decides to cooperate with the FBI. I don't care what it takes." Dan felt ice in his veins. They were talking about eliminating someone who might testify against Torino. Castellano ended the call and began moving toward the exit. Dan followed at a distance, pulling out his phone to text Hayes. "Castellano leaving. Urgent business. Maybe planning something tonight." Hayes's response came immediately. "Stay with the event. I'll follow him." Dan returned to the ballroom, but his mind was racing. Someone's life was in immediate danger, and there might be nothing they could do to prevent it. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced social interaction. Dan made a substantial donation to the Children's Cardiac Unit. It seemed like the least he could do after using the charity event for surveillance purposes. But his thoughts kept returning to Castellano's phone conversation. By the time the event ended at midnight, Dan had recorded several incriminating conversations and gathered intelligence about Torino's recruitment methods. But he couldn't shake the feeling that while they were gathering evidence, someone else was dying. Hayes was waiting in the hotel lobby when Dan returned. "Did you follow Castellano?" "As far as I could without being spotted. He drove to a warehouse district on the south side, but I couldn't get close enough to see what happened inside. We need to find out if someone was killed tonight. Rivera's monitoring police communications. If there's a body, we'll know about it within hours. And if there is..." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "Then we'll know that our timeline just got much shorter." They sat in Dan's hotel room, reviewing the recordings and photographs from the evening while waiting for news from Rivera. "Your wife is very good at what she does," Hayes observed, listening to one of Rebecca's conversations with Dr. Hoffman. "She's essentially conducting psychological manipulation at a professional level." "She was always charming," Dan said bitterly. "I just never realized she was using it as a weapon. Whitfield's operation is more sophisticated than I expected. They're not just targeting random professionals. They're building networks of compromised individuals who can recruit others. Like a virus." "Exactly. And once someone like Dr. Hoffman starts bringing other doctors into the operation, it becomes self-sustaining." Dan's phone buzzed with a text from Rivera. "Body found in warehouse district. Male, mid-30s, multiple gunshot wounds. Preliminary ID suggests accounting professional from Schaumburg." Hayes and Dan looked at each other grimly. "Someone else who wouldn't cooperate," Hayes said. "Or someone who was about to testify. Either way, it confirms what we already knew. These people kill anyone who threatens their operation." Dan felt a cold fury building inside him. While they'd been playing spy games at a charity fundraiser, Vincent Torino had ordered the execution of another innocent person. "How long before they come after us?" "Depends on how careful we've been and how paranoid they are. But I'd estimate we have maybe 2 weeks before they figure out that someone's actively investigating them. Then we need to move faster." Hayes nodded. "Tomorrow we hit Rebecca's apartment. It's time to stop gathering intelligence and start taking action." "What kind of action?" The kind that makes them understand they're not the only ones willing to use violence to solve problems. Dan looked out the hotel window at the Chicago skyline. Somewhere out there, Vincent Torino was sleeping comfortably in his mansion, believing himself untouchable. Rebecca was probably in some expensive hotel suite, counting the money she'd earned by destroying her marriage. Rivera called at 2 in the morning with more details about the warehouse murder. Victim's name was Brian Murphy, Rivera reported. 34 years old, married with 2 kids. Worked as a senior accountant for Peterson Associates in Schaumburg. Was he one of Torino's targets? Looks like it. Neighbors reported that he'd been receiving threatening phone calls for the past week. Wife told police he seemed terrified but wouldn't explain why. Dan felt sick. They killed him because he wouldn't cooperate. Or because he was thinking about going to the police. Either way, it's a message to anyone else who might be considering defiance. What about his family? Wife and kids are in protective custody, but the police don't have enough evidence to connect the murder to Torino directly. Hayes took the phone. Tony, I need you to do something for me. Find out everything you can about Murphy's last few days. Where he went, who he talked to, what he might have told his wife. Why? Because if we can establish a pattern for how Torino targets and eliminates threats, we might be able to predict his next moves. After hanging up, Hayes turned to Dan. This changes our timeline. If Torino's eliminating potential witnesses, we could be next on his list. You think he knows about us? Not yet, but it's only a matter of time. We need to accelerate our plans. What does that mean? It means tomorrow we don't just search your wife's apartment for evidence. We start sending Torino a message that he's not the only one who can escalate situations. Dan felt a chill. What kind of message? The kind that makes him understand he's dealing with people who are willing to play by his rules. The next morning, Hayes arrived at Dan's hotel with a large duffel bag and a grim expression. I've been thinking about our situation all night, he said, setting the bag on the bed. We're facing an enemy who has resources, connections, and no moral constraints. If we're going to survive this, we need to level the playing field. What's in the bag? Hayes unzipped it, revealing an array of equipment that looked like it belonged in a spy movie. Electronic devices, cameras, listening equipment, and what appeared to be lock-picking tools. Surveillance gear, mostly, but also some items that will help us send clearer messages when the time comes. Hayes, I want these people stopped, but I don't want to become a terrorist. Neither do I. But I want you to understand something. Vincent Torino has been operating for 20 years because he's willing to do things that decent people won't do. If we limit ourselves to methods that won't make us uncomfortable, we'll end up like Brian Murphy. Dan examined one of the electronic devices. What is this? GPS tracker. Very small, very sophisticated. Once we plant it on someone's car, we can monitor their movements indefinitely. And this? Audio recorder designed to look like a pen. Battery lasts for 12 hours. Memory can store up to 48 hours of conversation. Hayes pulled out what looked like a small plastic box. This is more specialized. It's a portable signal detector that can identify when someone is trying to make calls or send messages within a limited area. Why would we need that? Because if we're going to confront your wife or Whitfield directly, we want to know if they're trying to call for backup. Confront them? I thought we were just gathering evidence. Hayes sat down and looked at Dan seriously. Dan, I need you to understand something. These people tried to torture you into becoming a criminal. When you refused, they nearly killed you. Your wife betrayed you for money and is now helping them target other families. Last night, they murdered an innocent man who had 2 young children. I know all that. Do you? Because if you really understand what we're dealing with, then you know that gathering evidence for a legal case that might take years isn't enough. Brian Murphy's kids will grow up without a father while Vincent Torino enjoys his freedom. Dan was quiet for several minutes. What are you suggesting we do? I'm suggesting we make them understand that their actions have immediate consequences. Not legal consequences that might happen years from now, but real consequences that happen quickly enough to prevent them from hurting more people. You're talking about vigilante justice. I'm talking about protecting innocent people when the system can't or won't do it. Dan thought about Brian Murphy's children, about the 3 men Rebecca was currently targeting, about all the future victims who would suffer if Torino remained free to operate. All right, he said quietly. What's the plan? Hayes smiled grimly. First, we gather intelligence from your wife's apartment. Then we use that intelligence to disrupt their operations in ways that can't be ignored. And if they retaliate, they will retaliate. The question is whether we're prepared for it. They spent the next hour reviewing the layout of Rebecca's apartment building and planning their approach. Hayes had spent several days conducting surveillance of the building, noting security camera locations, guard patterns, and access points. The building has 12 units, doorman during the day, electronic locks on all entrances, Hayes explained. Your wife's apartment is on the 8th floor, facing east. How do we get inside? Service entrance in the basement is only monitored by one camera, and it has a blind spot near the delivery dock. From there, we can access the service elevator without being seen. What about the apartment itself? Standard residential locks, probably an alarm system, but nothing military grade. I can handle both. How long will we have? According to Rivera's surveillance, your wife typically leaves around 10 a.m. and doesn't return until late evening. That gives us most of the day if we move quickly. At 11 a.m., they approached the apartment building through an alley that ran behind the complex. Hayes had changed into coveralls that made him look like a maintenance worker, and Dan was dressed as his assistant. The service entrance was exactly as Hayes had described. They slipped through the blind spot, and Hayes used a small electronic device to bypass the lock, a technique he'd learned during his military service. How did you learn to do that? Special ops training. Sometimes you need to get into places quietly. The service elevator took them to the 8th floor without incident. Hayes examined Rebecca's door for several minutes before producing his lockpicking tools. Alarm system? Dan asked nervously. Standard residential setup. I can disable it, but we'll have about 30 seconds after I open the door. Hayes worked with practiced efficiency, and within 2 minutes they were inside Rebecca's apartment. The space was exactly what Dan had expected. Expensive furniture, high-end appliances, designer clothing hanging in the closet. But there were also signs of the person Rebecca had become: multiple cell phones charging on the kitchen counter, a laptop computer secured with what looked like military-grade encryption, and business cards from men whose names Dan didn't recognize. Start with the computer, Hayes said, setting up a small device next to Rebecca's laptop. This will copy her hard drive while we search the rest of the apartment. Dan felt strange going through Rebecca's personal belongings. Even after everything she'd done, there was something invasive about searching through her private space. Find anything interesting? Hayes called from the bedroom. Multiple phones, encrypted laptop, business cards from what looked like potential targets. Check the bathroom medicine cabinet. Dan opened the cabinet and found exactly what Hayes had suspected. Birth control pills, expensive cosmetics, and a small bag containing what appeared to be Rohypnol, date rape drugs. She's drugging people, Dan said, his voice filled with disgust. Probably slipping it into drinks at social events to make targets more compliant during questioning. Hayes emerged from the bedroom carrying a small safe. Found this hidden behind her dresser. Can you think of any combinations she might use? Dan tried several possibilities. Birthdays, anniversaries, social security numbers. Nothing worked. We'll have to take it with us, Hayes said. I know someone who can open it without damaging the contents. The laptop finished copying, and Hayes began planting listening devices throughout the apartment, in the living room, bedroom, and kitchen. These will let us monitor her conversations for the next few weeks, he explained. Battery life is about 30 days, and they're virtually undetectable. As they prepared to leave, Dan spotted something that made his blood run cold. A photo album filled with pictures of potential targets. Brian Murphy was there, along with several other men Dan didn't recognize. But what was truly chilling was that some of the photos had red X's drawn across them. "Hayes, look at this." Hayes examined the album. "These are men who refused to cooperate. The X's mark the ones who've been eliminated." Dan counted 12 photographs with red X's. 12 people. Torino has killed 12 people for refusing to launder his money. That we know of. There could be more. And Rebecca helped target every one of them. Hayes was studying the unmarked photographs. These men are still alive, which means they're either cooperating with Torino or they don't know they're being targeted yet. We have to warn them. Some of them, yes, but others might already be compromised. If we contact them directly, we could be alerting Torino that someone's interfering with his operations. They left the apartment with copies of Rebecca's computer files, the safe, and photographs of all the documents they'd found. As they drove back to Rivera's office, Dan felt a mixture of satisfaction and revulsion. They'd gathered valuable intelligence, but they'd also confirmed that Rebecca was complicit in multiple murders. Rivera was waiting for them with news about Brian Murphy's final days. He received his first threatening phone call 8 days ago, Rivera reported. According to his wife, someone told him that his consulting services were needed for a special project. When Murphy said he wasn't interested in consulting work, the caller became more explicit about what was required. What kind of consulting? Restructuring financial reports for a real estate development company to hide the source of certain investments. Torino Properties. Most likely. Murphy told his wife he was going to contact the police, but before he could, the threats escalated. Someone told him that his family would be hurt if he talked to law enforcement. Hayes was examining the contents of Rebecca's safe, which had been opened by Rivera's contact. "Look at this." He handed Dan a list of names and addresses. Some of the names were familiar from the photo album, but others were new. Future targets? Looks like it, but there's something else. Hayes pointed to notations beside each name. These numbers beside the names, they look like fee structures. Dan examined the list more carefully. She's being paid per target. $5,000 for initial contact, $10,000 for successful recruitment, $25,000 if the target cooperates long-term. Your wife has turned betrayal into a business model. Rivera pulled up a map on his computer. I've been tracking the addresses on this list. 3 of the men live within 10 miles of each other in northwest suburban Chicago. What kind of neighborhood? Affluent professional community. Lots of doctors, lawyers, accountants. Perfect hunting ground for Torino's operation. Dan studied the map. We need to warn them. Some of them, Hayes agreed. But we need to be strategic about it. If we warn everyone at once, Torino will know someone has access to his target list. So we warn them one at a time. We warn the ones who are in immediate danger, and we use the others as opportunities to gather more evidence. Rivera was studying financial records from Rebecca's computer. According to these files, she's scheduled to make contact with the Dr. Stephen Walsh tomorrow evening. There's a medical conference at the Hyatt downtown. What's the approach? Standard pattern. Casual meeting at the hotel bar, conversation about investment opportunities, exchange of contact information. Then follow up over the next week to develop the relationship. Hayes was studying Walsh's photograph. He looks like a family man. Wedding ring, pictures of kids in his wallet. He has no idea what he's walking into. Unless we warn him. Dan thought about Brian Murphy's children, growing up without their father because he'd refused to become a criminal. We can't let that happen to another family. Agreed. But we need to be smarter about how we handle it. Hayes spread out the photographs from Rebecca's album. I have an idea, but it's going to require taking some risks. What kind of risks? The kind that involve confronting your wife directly. Dan felt his pulse quicken. You want to intercept her tomorrow night? I want to do more than that. I want to make her understand that her actions have consequences. What do you mean? Hayes was quiet for a moment. I mean, it's time to send Vincent Torino a message he can't ignore. What kind of message? The kind that makes him understand he's not the only one willing to escalate situations. Dan looked between Hayes and Rivera. They were asking him to cross a line from which there would be no return. But he thought about the 12 men with red X's across their photographs, about Brian Murphy's children, about Dr. Walsh walking unknowingly into a trap tomorrow night. All right, Dan said quietly. What do you need me to do? Hayes smiled grimly. Tomorrow night, you're going to have a conversation with your wife, and you're going to make sure she remembers it for the rest of her life. Tomorrow, they would begin to learn otherwise. The war had officially begun. The next evening, Daniel Cross stood in shadows outside the Hyatt Regency downtown, watching the entrance where Rebecca was scheduled to meet Dr. Stephen Walsh. He wore dark clothing and a baseball cap, nearly invisible in the alcove where Hayes had positioned him. Target approaching from the north. Hayes's voice crackled through his earpiece. White female, red dress, matching your wife's description. Dan's pulse quickened as Rebecca walked confidently toward the hotel. She looked stunning, every inch the professional woman Dr. Walsh would expect to meet. But Dan knew her appearance was calculated to disarm targets. Dr. Walsh arrived 15 minutes ago, Rivera reported from inside. He's at the bar alone, checking his watch. Copy that, Hayes responded. Dan, you ready? In minutes, he would confront the woman who had betrayed him and help target innocent families. This conversation would determine whether Dr. Walsh went home safely or became another victim. I'm ready. Remember, we need her to understand her activities are being monitored, but we can't reveal how much we know. Goal is to disrupt tonight's operation and send a message to Torino. Dan watched Rebecca enter. Through the windows, he could see her scan the bar until she spotted Walsh. The doctor stood with a confused but pleased expression as she approached, clearly not expecting such an attractive contact. They're making contact, Rivera reported. Walsh looked surprised but interested. Dan entered through a side entrance leading to the bar area. The space was dimly lit, filled with medical conference attendees unwinding after presentations. Perfect cover. He positioned himself with a clear view of Rebecca and Walsh, close enough to overhear but far enough to avoid immediate recognition. Dr. Walsh, thank you for meeting me, Rebecca was saying, voice warm and professional. I hope you don't mind that I'm not what you expected. Not at all, Walsh replied, charmed. Though when your colleague said someone wanted to discuss investment opportunities, I imagined a different kind of meeting. People are more comfortable discussing financial matters in relaxed environments. May I buy you a drink? Walsh was half finished with what appeared to be his second scotch. That's very kind, miss. Sterling. Rebecca Sterling. I work with Whitfield Associates. We specialize in helping medical professionals diversify their investment portfolios. Dan felt sick hearing her use her maiden name and watching her slip into her predatory role. What kind of investments do you typically recommend? Walsh asked. Well, that depends on your current situation and risk tolerance. But many of our clients have found real estate development projects to be quite lucrative. Real estate? I don't know much about that market. That's exactly why you need expert guidance. Dr. Walsh, may I ask what your current annual income is? Walsh hesitated. I'm not sure I should discuss specific numbers. Rebecca leaned forward slightly, her body language becoming more intimate. Of course, I understand your discretion, but in order to recommend appropriate investment levels, I need to understand your financial capacity. Dan watched her technique with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. She was systematically gathering information about Walsh's financial situation while making him feel like he was being offered exclusive opportunities. "I suppose it wouldn't hurt to give you a general range," Walsh said, clearly affected by her proximity and charm. "My practice generates approximately $400,000 annually. That's wonderful. And do you handle your own investments? Or do you work with a financial advisor?" "I have a guy who manages my retirement accounts, but I've been looking for more aggressive investment opportunities." "Perfect. Dr. Walsh, I think you'd be very interested in a project we're currently developing. It's a mixed-use development in River North with some very unique financing structures." Dan knew this was the moment when Rebecca would begin drawing Walsh into Torino's web. He stood up and walked toward their table. "Excuse me," he said, approaching from behind Rebecca. "Rebecca Sterling?" Rebecca turned around, and her face went completely white when she saw him. She stared at him for several long moments, confusion and recognition warring in her expression. Do I know you?" she asked hesitantly, something familiar in his voice and bearing making her uneasy. "You should," Dan said quietly. "After all, we were married for 5 years. Rebecca's eyes widened in shock as the pieces clicked into place. "Dan?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But you look different. Facial reconstruction surgery will do that. You remember, after your friends beat me nearly to death. Hello, Rebecca. Or should I say, hello, Mrs. Cross? Since we're still legally married." Dr. Walsh looked confused. "I'm sorry. Do you two know each other?" "Oh yes," Dan said, pulling out a chair and sitting down without invitation. "Rebecca is my wife, though she's been using her maiden name professionally for the past year or so." "Your wife?" Walsh looked between them, clearly sensing tension but not understanding its source. "That's right. Dr. Walsh, has my wife told you what kind of business she's really in?" Rebecca had recovered from her initial shock and was trying to regain control of the situation. "Dan, what are you doing here? How did you find me?" "I've been learning a lot about your activities lately, Rebecca. Very educational." "Dr. Walsh," Rebecca said, her voice strained. "I'm sorry, but there seems to be some kind of personal situation here. Perhaps we should reschedule our meeting." "Actually, Doctor, I think you should hear what I have to say before you make any investment decisions with my wife." Walsh was looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Perhaps I should leave you two to work out your domestic issues." "Dr. Walsh," Dan said, his voice becoming more serious, "my wife isn't really in the investment business. She works for people who launder money for organized crime, and she's trying to recruit you to help them." Walsh laughed nervously. "I'm sorry, what?" Rebecca stood up abruptly. "Dan, you're obviously having some kind of breakdown. Dr. Walsh, please don't listen to him." "Sit down, Rebecca," Dan said quietly, and something in his voice made her freeze. "Dr. Walsh, my wife works for a man named Vincent Torino, who runs a criminal organization here in Chicago. She identifies professional people like yourself who might be useful for money laundering operations." "This is insane," Rebecca said, but her voice was shaking. "Is it? Dr. Walsh, did she ask about your income level? Did she mention real estate investments with unique financing structures? Did she suggest that you could make a lot of money while maintaining privacy from regulatory agencies?" Walsh's expression was changing from confusion to alarm. "How did you know what we discussed?" "Because it's the same script she uses with all her targets. Dr. Walsh, I'm going to give you some advice that could save your life. Go home to your family tonight. Don't give Rebecca any contact information. Don't accept any follow-up calls about investment opportunities. And if anyone approaches you in the future claiming to represent Whitfield Associates, contact the FBI immediately." "Dan, stop this," Rebecca hissed. "You don't know what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing. Dr. Walsh, 3 nights ago, A man named Brian Murphy was murdered because he refused to cooperate with the people my wife works for. He had 2 young children. Walsh stood up abruptly. I think I need to leave. That's a very smart decision, Doctor. Have a safe trip home. After Walsh hurried away, Dan and Rebecca sat alone at the table. She was staring at him with a mixture of fear and fury. How long have you been following me? She asked. Long enough to understand what you've become. What I've become. Dan, you have no idea what you're involved in. These people don't play games. You mean the people you work for? The ones who had me tortured in our own home. Rebecca's mask of composure finally cracked. I never wanted that to happen. I told Marcus that you'd never cooperate, but he insisted on trying. You told him I'd never cooperate? Rebecca, you set me up. You fed them information about my schedule, my clients, my work methods. You helped them plan the whole thing. I needed the money. You needed $300,000? For what? To get away from you. The words hit Dan like a physical blow. What? Dan, I was suffocating in our marriage. You were so predictable, so satisfied with your boring little life. When Marcus offered me a chance to make real money and live differently, I took it. So you decided to destroy our marriage and help criminals instead of just asking for a divorce? It wasn't supposed to go that far. At first, they just wanted information about your clients. It seemed harmless. Harmless? Rebecca, 12 people are dead because of the information you provided. That's not my fault. I didn't kill anyone. You might as well have pulled the trigger yourself. Rebecca was quiet for several minutes. When she spoke again, her voice was different, colder, more calculating. Dan, you need to walk away from this. Tonight. Forget about me. Forget about what happened. And disappear. Change your name. Move to another city. Start over. Why would I do that? Because Vincent knows you're alive, and he knows you can identify the people who hurt you. Right now, he thinks you're too scared to cause problems. But if he finds out you're actively interfering with his operations, he'll try to kill me again. He'll succeed this time. Dan leaned back in his chair, studying the woman who had been his wife. Rebecca, let me ask you something. Do you feel any guilt at all about what you've done? About Brian Murphy's children? About the families you're helping to destroy? I feel guilty about what happened to you, she said quietly. But the rest of it, Dan, these people were going to be targeted by someone eventually. At least with me, they have a chance to cooperate and survive. Like Brian Murphy did. Brian Murphy was an idiot who thought he could play hero. If he'd just done what they asked, he'd still be alive. Dan felt a cold fury building inside him. The woman sitting across from him wasn't the person he'd married. That woman had been replaced by someone who could justify murder as a business necessity. Rebecca, I want you to deliver a message to Vincent Torino for me. What kind of message? Tell him that someone is watching his operation. Someone who knows about his targets, his methods, and his people. Someone who isn't afraid of him. Rebecca's eyes widened. Dan, you can't be serious. You're an accountant. You have no idea what you're up against. Tell him that if he hurts any more innocent people, there will be consequences. What kind of consequences? Dan stood up from the table. The kind that come from people who are willing to play by his rules. Dan, wait. Rebecca grabbed his arm. Please, if you care about me at all, walk away from this. Dan looked down at her hand on his arm, then back at her face. Rebecca, I loved you for 5 years. I trusted you completely. I would have done anything for you. I know. But the woman I loved is gone. The person sitting here is someone who helps criminals torture innocent people for money. I don't care what happens to you anymore. He pulled his arm free and walked toward the hotel exit, leaving Rebecca sitting alone at the table. Through his earpiece, he heard Hayes's voice. Good work. Target is making a phone call, probably to Whitfield or Torino. We should move to phase 2. What's phase 2? making sure they understand that tonight wasn't a random encounter. Dan met Hayes and Rivera in the hotel parking garage, where they had been monitoring the situation from Rivera's surveillance van. "How much of that did you record?" Dan asked. "All of it," Rivera replied. "Both audio and video. Rebecca's admission that she provided information to facilitate your attack is particularly useful. What about her warning that Torino knows I'm alive?" Hayes was studying video feeds from cameras they'd placed around the hotel. "She's right about that. We always knew this would escalate once we started interfering with their operations. So what's our next move?" "We make sure Torino understands that we're not random interference. We're a targeted threat to his organization." Rivera pulled out a map of Chicago. "I've been tracking Torino's movements for the past week. He has a predictable pattern: business meetings downtown during the day, dinner at expensive restaurants in the evening, home to his mansion in Lake Forest before midnight." "You want to approach him directly?" "Not approach," Hayes said. "Send a message." "What kind of message?" Hayes was assembling equipment from his duffel bag. "The kind that makes him understand his people aren't as safe as he thinks they are." Dan felt a chill. "Hayes, what exactly are you planning?" "Nothing that will permanently harm anyone, but something that will make it clear that we know where his people live, work, and spend their time." "You're talking about intimidation." "I'm talking about leveling the playing field. Torino uses fear as a weapon. It's time he experienced some fear himself." Rivera was monitoring radio communications. "Dan, your wife just left the hotel. She's heading north, probably to meet with Whitfield." "Good," Hayes said. "That gives us time to prepare our next move." "Which is?" "Tomorrow morning, Vincent Torino is going to wake up and discover that someone left him a very personal message. Something that makes it clear we know exactly who he is and where to find him." Dan thought about Brian Murphy's children, about Dr. Walsh going home safely to his family, about all the future victims who might be spared if Torino understood he was no longer untouchable. "What do you need me to do?" Hayes smiled grimly. "Tomorrow morning, you're going to help me deliver a message that Vincent Torino will never forget." At 3 a.m., Dan found himself crouched in the bushes outside Vincent Torino's mansion in Lake Forest, holding a bag of equipment while Hayes studied the estate's security system. The house was enormous, a sprawling colonial structure set on several acres of manicured grounds, protected by gates, cameras, and motion sensors. "This is going to be tricky," Hayes whispered as he observed the security layout. "High-end system, probably military contractor grade. We'll have maybe a 10-minute window before they notice anything." "What if Torino has private security?" "He does. 2 guards in a car at the front gate, 2 more patrolling the grounds, and at least 1 inside the house. These aren't amateurs." Hayes spent nearly 30 minutes carefully studying guard patterns and timing their movements. "We wait for the perimeter guards to complete their circuit. Then we have exactly 8 minutes before they come back around." They moved silently across the perfectly maintained lawn, staying low and timing their movements to avoid the security camera's sweep patterns. The mansion's back door was protected by a sophisticated alarm system. Hayes worked for several tense minutes with specialized equipment to create a temporary bypass. "This won't last long," he whispered. "Maybe 5 minutes before the system detects the irregularity." They slipped inside, finding themselves in a kitchen that was larger than Dan's entire apartment. Every second counted now. "Torino's bedroom should be on the 2nd floor," Hayes whispered, based on his surveillance observations of the house's lighting patterns over several nights. "We go up, leave our message, and get out fast." They climbed a marble staircase that was probably worth more than most people's cars. The 2nd floor hallway was lined with expensive artwork and furniture that demonstrated the wealth Torino had accumulated through decades of criminal activity. Hayes stopped outside a set of double doors and listened carefully. From inside, they could hear the sound of deep, regular breathing. 2 people, Hayes whispered. Torino and probably a woman. Hayes opened his bag and removed what appeared to be a small photograph. He placed it carefully on the floor directly in front of the bedroom doors, where Torino would see it immediately upon leaving his room. The photograph showed Vincent Torino himself, taken with a telephoto lens while he was having dinner at an expensive restaurant 3 nights earlier. But someone had drawn a red X across his face, the same mark that Rebecca had made on the photographs of Torino's victims. Beside the photograph, Hayes placed a typed note. 12 innocent people have died because of your greed. No more. We know who you are. We know where you live. We know where you go. The next time you order someone's death, remember that you are not untouchable. That's it. Dan whispered. That's enough. The message is clear. We can reach him anywhere, anytime we choose to. They left the house as quietly as they'd entered, making their way back across the grounds to where Rivera was waiting with the car. As they drove away, Dan felt a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. They'd successfully delivered their message, but they'd also crossed a line that would inevitably lead to retaliation. How long before he finds it? Dan asked. Torino typically wakes up around 7 a.m., Rivera replied. He'll see our message when he leaves his bedroom. And then he'll understand that someone is actively hunting him, Hayes said. The question is how he responds. They didn't have to wait long for an answer. At 8:30 that morning, Rivera's police scanner began reporting unusual activity throughout Chicago. Multiple break-ins reported in Lincoln Park area, the dispatcher was saying. Suspects appear to be searching for specific individual. No injuries reported, but extensive property damage. They're looking for you, Rivera said grimly. How do they know where to look? They probably started with your hotel, then expanded to nearby areas. Torino has enough manpower to search every building in a 10-block radius. Hayes was monitoring multiple communication channels. It's worse than that. They're also hitting places associated with your old life, your office building, your former home, places where your friends and family live. Dan felt sick. Are they hurting people? Not yet, but they're making it clear that they can reach anyone connected to you. So what do? We escalate, Hayes said simply. What do you mean? I mean we make Torino understand that threatening innocent people will result in immediate consequences for him personally. Rivera was studying a map of the searches being conducted throughout the city. They're being systematic about this. Military-style search pattern. Multiple teams working in coordination. Which means Torino is taking our message seriously. It also means he's committed significant resources to finding us. If we can disrupt those search teams, we can send another message, Dan finished. Hayes was already assembling equipment. Dan, I need you to understand something. Up until now, we've been playing games. Gathering intelligence, sending warnings, making threats. But if we start hitting Torino's people directly, this becomes real warfare. People could get hurt. People are already getting hurt. The question is whether we're willing to make sure the right people get hurt. Dan thought about the 12 families who had lost loved ones to Torino's greed, about Brian Murphy's children, about the search teams that were probably terrorizing innocent people throughout Chicago right now. What's the plan? Hayes smiled grimly. We're going to make Vincent Torino's day much worse than he expected. For the next 6 hours, they conducted what Hayes called surgical strikes against Torino's search operation. They disabled vehicles, interfered with communications, and left messages that made it clear the search teams themselves were being hunted. By 3 p.m., police scanners were reporting that the search had been called off and Torino's people were withdrawing from the field. Phase 1 complete, Hayes announced. Now for Phase 2, which is direct confrontation with Vincent Torino himself. Rivera had been monitoring Torino's communications all day. He scheduled to meet with Marcus Whitfield at 4 p.m. Private dining room at the Chicago Club downtown. Security? Minimal. The club has its own discreet security, and Torino probably figures he's safe in such an exclusive environment. Wrong assumption, Hayes said. You want to approach him at the Chicago club? I want to have a conversation with him, just like you had a conversation with your wife last night. Dan felt his pulse quicken. What kind of conversation? The kind that makes him understand his options have changed. At 4:15 p.m., Dan walked into the Chicago club wearing an expensive suit and carrying identification that identified him as David Carter, Executive Vice President, Brennan Associates. The club's security was exactly as Rivera had described, discreet but not paranoid, designed to keep out unwanted guests rather than professional operators. Hayes had positioned himself in the club's kitchen, having gained access through a service entrance while wearing catering staff uniforms. Rivera was monitoring communications from a van parked across the street. Dan located the private dining room where Torino and Whitfield were meeting. Through the partially open door, he could hear their conversation. The situation is getting out of hand, Whitfield was saying. Whoever these people are, they have professional capabilities. Which means they're not random interference, Torino replied. Someone with resources is targeting our operation specifically. Any idea who? I have suspicions. The timing suggests it's connected to the Cross situation. Dan's blood ran cold hearing his own name. Cross is supposed to be neutralized, Whitfield said. Apparently not as neutralized as we thought. So what do? We eliminate the problem permanently, and we make sure there are no loose ends this time. Dan had heard enough. He pushed open the door and walked into the private dining room. Good afternoon, gentlemen. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Both men looked up in shock. Whitfield reached for his phone, but Dan held up his hand. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Marcus. We have people monitoring all communications in this building, so any calls you make will be intercepted. Torino recovered from his surprise more quickly than Whitfield. Mr. Cross, I presume? You look different than I expected. Facial reconstruction surgery will do that. You remember from when your people beat me nearly to death. I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about. Dan pulled out a chair and sat down at their table uninvited. Vincent, can I call you Vincent? We need to have a conversation about your business practices. I think you're confused about who you're dealing with, Mr. Cross. Actually, I think you're the one who's confused. You see, Vincent, you've been operating for 20 years under the assumption that you're untouchable. That people like me will either cooperate with your demands or suffer the consequences quietly. And you think you're different. I know I'm different, because I'm the one who left you that photograph this morning. Torino's facade of calm cracked slightly. That was you. That was me. Did you like our message? What do you want? I want you to stop killing innocent people. Torino laughed. Mr. Cross, do you have any idea how many people work for me? How much money I control? How many ways I can reach you and everyone you care about? Do you have any idea how many ways I can reach you? You're bluffing. Dan pulled out his phone and showed Torino a photograph. A picture of Torino's own bedroom, taken that morning while he was sleeping. In the photo, a hand could be seen placing the message on the floor, demonstrating how close they'd gotten without him knowing. Torino went pale. How did you get into my house? The same way we got into this club. Vincent, you've been living in a bubble, surrounded by people who tell you you're invincible. But you're not. You're just a man who's been lucky for 20 years. What do you want from me? I want you to retire. Immediately. Shut down your money laundering operations. Stop targeting innocent families, and disappear from Chicago. And if I refuse, then we'll continue demonstrating that you're not as safe as you think you are. Whitfield finally found his voice. Mr. Cross, you're making a very serious mistake. Vincent has resources you can't imagine. Marcus, your client is about to learn that resources aren't everything. Sometimes, the person who's willing to go further wins. Torino leaned back in his chair, studying Dan with new interest. You know, Mr. Cross, I might have underestimated you. Most people who refuse my initial offer don't survive to make counteroffers. Most people don't have my motivation, which is justice for 12 innocent families. Ah yes, the bleeding heart speech. Mr. Cross, let me explain something to you about the world. There are wolves and there are sheep. I'm a wolf. You're a sheep who's pretending to be a wolf. Maybe, but this sheep has already gotten into your house, disrupted your operations, and is currently sitting at your private table in one of the most exclusive clubs in Chicago. Fair point. Torino was quiet for several minutes. Mr. Cross, what makes you think I won't simply have you killed when you leave here? Because you're smart enough to know that killing me would only escalate the situation. My partners aren't as interested in conversation as I am. Partners? Did you think I was doing this alone? Torino exchanged glances with Whitfield. Who are you working with? People who are better at violence than you are. I doubt that. Dan's phone buzzed with a text message. He read it and smiled. Vincent, you might want to check your own phone. Torino looked at his phone and found a text message with a photograph attached. The photo showed Frank Castellano sitting in his car outside his apartment building, completely unaware that he was being watched through a sniper scope. Your enforcer is currently having lunch in Lincoln Park, Dan said conversationally. One phone call from me, and he'll be having a very bad day. Torino's hands were shaking as he put down his phone. What do you want? I told you what I want. Complete shutdown of your criminal operations in Chicago. That's impossible. I have obligations, commitments. Then you'll have to break them. The people I work with don't accept broken commitments. That sounds like your problem, not mine. Torino was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, How do I know you won't come after me even if I comply with your demands? Because I'm not interested in revenge, Vincent. I'm interested in preventing future victims. And if I refuse, then we'll continue this conversation until you change your mind. And my partners will continue demonstrating that your people aren't as safe as they think they are. Torino looked at the photograph of Castellano again. You're serious about this. Completely serious. Mr. Cross, you're asking me to give up everything I've built over 20 years. I'm asking you to stop destroying families for profit. And you think that's a reasonable request? I think it's the only request that keeps you alive. Torino was quiet for several more minutes. When he spoke again, his voice was different, tired, defeated. What exactly are you proposing? Immediate cessation of all money laundering activities. No more targeting of innocent professionals. No more threats against potential witnesses. And permanent departure from Chicago. Where am I supposed to go? That's your choice. But somewhere far from here. And my existing clients? Find someone else to handle their business. Mr. Cross, do you understand what you're asking? The people I work with don't just let you walk away. Then you'll have to convince them that staying is more dangerous than leaving. Torino looked at Whitfield, who had remained silent during most of the conversation. Marcus, what do you think? I think we're dealing with someone who's prepared to follow through on his threats. So do I. Torino turned back to Dan. Mr. Cross, if I agree to your terms, how do I know you won't decide later that I deserve punishment for my past activities? Because I'm not interested in punishment. I'm interested in prevention. You're asking me to trust you. I'm asking you to make a rational decision based on changed circumstances. Torino was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, I need time to think about this. How much time? 24 hours. You have 12 hours. That's not enough time to. Vincent, 12 hours ago you were planning to have me killed. Now you're negotiating the terms of your retirement. I'd say your circumstances have changed quite rapidly. Torino stood up from the table. Mr. Cross, you've given me a lot to think about. I hope you'll think carefully. Oh, I will. very carefully. As Torino and Whitfield prepared to leave, Torino turned back to Dan. "Mr. Cross, can I ask you something?" "Sure. What kind of man were you before all this started?" "A very different one. Do you miss him?" Dan thought about the question seriously. "Sometimes. But he couldn't protect the people who needed protecting. And you can. We'll find out, won't we?" After they left, Dan sat alone in the private dining room for several minutes, processing what had just happened. He'd successfully confronted one of Chicago's most dangerous criminals and forced him to consider abandoning everything he'd built over 20 years. But he'd also threatened to kill people, infiltrated private property, and committed acts that would be considered terrorism by many definitions. The Daniel Cross who had stepped off that plane from Las Vegas 6 weeks ago would be horrified by what he'd become. Through his earpiece, he heard Hayes's voice. "Excellent work. Target is leaving the building with Whitfield. They're both visibly shaken. What's our next move?" "We wait 12 hours and see if Torino is smart enough to accept reality. And if he isn't, then we demonstrate that our threats weren't bluffs." Dan left the Chicago club and met Hayes and Rivera several blocks away. They drove in silence to a safe house Hayes had arranged, a small apartment in a nondescript building where they could wait to see how Torino would respond. "Do you think he'll actually leave Chicago?" Rivera asked. "I think he's smart enough to understand that his situation has fundamentally changed," Hayes replied. "But criminals like Torino have egos that don't always allow for rational decision-making. What if he decides to fight? Then this gets much messier." Dan was staring out the window at the Chicago skyline. "Hayes, can I ask you something?" "Sure. Do you think we're the good guys in this?" Hayes was quiet for a moment. "I think we're people who were forced to become something we never wanted to be because the system couldn't protect innocent people from predators." "That's not really an answer." "Dan, 6 weeks ago you were a regular guy with a normal life. Vincent Torino took that away from you. He's taken it away from at least 12 other families that we know of. The question isn't whether we're good guys. The question is whether we're willing to stop bad guys when no one else can or will. And if we become like them in the process, then we'll deal with that consequence when we have to. But right now, the only choice is between allowing Torino to continue destroying lives or stopping him ourselves." At 11 p.m., Rivera's monitoring equipment picked up an encrypted phone call from Torino to an unknown number. "Can you decode it?" Dan asked. "Not the content, but I can track the call pattern. He's contacting multiple people, probably his superiors in whatever organization he reports to." "You think he's asking permission to leave? Or asking for help to eliminate us?" They had their answer 2 hours later when Hayes' security contacts reported unusual activity throughout the city. "Multiple teams of armed men taking positions around locations associated with our identities," Hayes reported. "Torino's decided to fight." "How many people?" "At least 20 that we can identify. Probably more." Dan felt a chill. So much for rational decision-making. "Vincent Torino has been untouchable for 20 years, Rivera observed. "He probably can't accept that 3 people could force him out of Chicago. Then we'll have to teach him that lesson more directly." Hayes was assembling weapons and tactical equipment. "Dan, this is your last chance to walk away. Once we engage Torino's people in direct combat, there's no going back to any kind of normal life." Dan thought about Brian Murphy's children, about Dr. Walsh going home safely to his family, about all the future victims who would suffer if Vincent Torino remained free to operate. "I stopped having a normal life the night they tied me to a chair in my own home." "All right then." Hayes handed Dan a bulletproof vest. "Let's go end this." The final confrontation took place at dawn in a warehouse district on Chicago's south side, where Torino had gathered his forces for what he apparently intended to be a decisive battle. But Vincent Torino had made a critical error in judgment. He'd spent 20 years intimidating accountants, lawyers, and other professionals who had no experience with violence. He wasn't prepared to face people who understood warfare and were willing to use it. The confrontation was intense but brief. Hayes's military training and tactical planning gave them a significant advantage, but Torino's people were experienced and dangerous. In the end, Frank Castellano was killed along with 2 other members of Torino's organization when they refused to surrender. Several others were wounded and captured. Vincent Torino himself was shot in the shoulder while trying to flee, but survived. The FBI, who had been building their case and monitoring the situation, arrived shortly after the shooting stopped. They had been tracking both sides of the conflict and were prepared to make arrests. Dan approached the ambulance where Torino was being loaded for transport to the hospital. "Vincent," he said quietly. Torino looked up at him with a mixture of pain and defeat. "You win, Mr. Cross." "It wasn't about winning." "What was it about?" "It was about making sure you couldn't hurt any more families. And now you're going to prison for the rest of your life. The FBI has been building a case against you for 3 years, and the evidence we've gathered along with tonight's events and the witnesses who are now willing to testify finally gives them everything they need for a conviction." "What about you? What happens to Daniel Cross now?" Dan looked around at the aftermath of the battle, police cars, ambulances, FBI agents taking statements from witnesses. Daniel Cross died 6 weeks ago in a hospital bed. The person who took his place doesn't have a name yet. Was it worth it? Becoming someone you never wanted to be? Dan thought about the question seriously. Ask me in 10 years. As the ambulance drove away with Vincent Torino, Dan realized that his war was over, but his life was just beginning. He'd destroyed a criminal organization and prevented countless future victims, but he'd also become someone capable of violence and deception. The old Daniel Cross had believed in rules, systems, and the fundamental goodness of people. That man was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes justice required stepping outside the law. Standing in the dawn light surrounded by the debris of battle, Dan wondered if the trade had been worth it. But then he thought about Dr. Walsh going home safely to his family, and he knew it had been. The war was over. Now he had to figure out how to live with what he'd become. 6 months later, a man calling himself David Carter sat in a small cafe in Portland, Oregon, reading the Chicago Tribune online. The Federal Witness Protection Program had helped him establish his new identity after his crucial testimony against Vincent Torino's organization. While he wasn't officially in witness protection, the program was designed for cooperating criminals, not victims who fought back. The FBI had made arrangements to help him start over safely. The headline read, "Vincent Torino sentenced to life in prison without parole." The article detailed how a federal investigation had finally succeeded in convicting one of Chicago's most notorious crime bosses on charges including money laundering, conspiracy, and ordering the murders of at least 12 people. Rebecca Cross had testified against Torino in exchange for a reduced sentence. She would serve 5 years in federal prison for her role in the money laundering operation. Marcus Whitfield had been disbarred and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The man who had once been Daniel Cross closed the laptop and walked outside into the Oregon sunshine. He'd been working as a financial consultant under his new identity, helping small businesses with legitimate accounting needs. It was quiet work, honest work, the kind of life the old Daniel Cross might have appreciated. But sometimes, late at night, he received encrypted messages from Sam Hayes, who was using his military skills to help other victims of organized crime. And sometimes, David Carter would quietly disappear for a few days to assist with problems that couldn't be solved through legal channels. He'd learned that once you crossed certain lines, you could never really go back. But you could choose to use what you'd become to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. It wasn't the life Daniel Cross had planned, but it was the life he'd earned. And sometimes that was enough. Thank you for your viewing. See you next time. If you enjoyed this, subscribe to JK Tells a Story for more tales.